Доброго дня всім.
Good afternoon, everybody. We continue our series of webinars on the elections and the coverage of the election campaign. Today, we're going to have the fifth webinar. This is a part of the project of the Council of Europe supporting transparency, inclusiveness, and fairness of the election practices in Ukraine. It is also organized by the Human Rights Platform, NGO, and today we're going to be speaking about the media during the local election campaign, coverage and manipulations. We have the leading experts, media experts, Alexander Burmagin, Executive Director of the Human Rights Platform, NGO, as well as lawyer and media lawyer of the Human Rights Platform, Ludmila Prishka. I'm Diana Dutsik, and I would moderate this webinar. I'm the Executive Director of the Ukrainian Institute of Media and Communication. What are we going to be talking about today? In our agenda, we have several issues, and we will discuss them one by one. But before we start it, I want to ask our experts a question. Tell me, please, what is your first impression of the start of this election campaign, in particular, as it is covered by the media? You haven't seen anything? Is it any different from the previous presidential parliamentary campaigns? Good afternoon, everybody. Then I have a reciprocal question as to what do you consider to be the start of the election campaign? Well, the official start, the 5th of September. Well, I just think that it started much earlier. This campaign in July, we already could quite well see that it was taking place, at least as staged by certain political forces. My impression is, well, there is nothing that has changed dramatically now compared to 2019, because you watch one of the leading channels, you turn it on in the morning, and there you would have one political party, let's call it For All the Best Things Tomorrow. You turn it on the evening news program, you see the same political party in prime time in the news programs. And one can say that the leader of that party is an old friend of the channel's owner, but that's probably a coincidence. So even looking at that, if we talk about coverage or about giving certain benefits or compliance with the standards, then in terms of the media, everything is the same way that we had during the two national campaigns of 2019. Maybe within this context, one should review the official term of the media campaign, the timeline of it, because there is always this false start, and we all make believe that it is starting on one date, while in fact it starts much earlier. Well, our next webinar this Friday will be about campaigning only, and there is a lot of nuances there as well, but about this false start and the regulation of it, we've discussed this slightly with the experts publicly. There is a very simple solution that is used in many countries. About half a year before the official start of the campaign, those parties that are going to participate in the election, they submit their declarations to their central office, which administers the election campaign, well, let's say the CEC. And since that time, there is a special campaigning regime. For example, they're not allowed to offer political advertisement, or they can use the media, but thanks to some foundations, or let's say based on contracts with the party. But there is a general, let's say, there's the same conditions for everyone. Well, with us, the term of political advertisement was just introduced in the law, an advertisement where they confused and mixed up everything, because before that we said that we really have to differentiate between the general campaigning and general advertisement. Now it has become even more confused. So we have the real start of the campaign. The 5th of September is the start of the political process, while campaigning is only supposed to start now, because we now start seeing the participants after the regional organization nominate their candidates. And the election code says that once there is no subject of the election, there is no campaigning. Some people know that, others don't. Some parties stopped on the 5th of September before the election process started. The ones that have lawyers and experts, they continue doing that. Some others will even further on continue doing that, because at the local election campaign there are lots of different subjects. One region, for example, can nominate its candidates right now, and another one can do it on the very last day. And before the 24th of September, theoretically it should work, by placing its political advertisement, let's say, with the general conditions. It is political advertisement, but it's not election campaigning. That's why, in terms of the legal certainty and in terms of regulation, there are lots of things that can be discussed, and on the level of legislation will make our life even more complicated. We will talk about legislation a little later. And now our first subject is the general and special information about the election process. And I can say that the local election, I think, is much more complicated than the presidential or parliamentary election, because there are very many participants of the election process, very many. And I think that that makes everyone's life difficult, for the media, for the voters, for the participants of the process. So what is important within this context is how can voters learn about all the processes of the election campaign, about all the participants of this process. I think that this is a very important aspect, because without proper information it's hard to make adequate decisions while voting. How does the process of informing the voters happen? We will hear about that from our media expert, Ludmila Oprishko. Thank you, Diana. Good afternoon, dear viewers and listeners. It's true that the object, a lot depends on how the information is delivered, because every voter should make one's conscious choice, informed choice, as the law establishes. But I agree with you, Diana, that in this situation, an important role would be played by the local media, the local printed press, that should deliver the necessary information to the voters, because the national TV channels in that situation cannot play that leading prominent role that they usually play during the presidential or parliamentary election. That's why it is true that in this situation an important role would be played by the local media. And the local media should know and understand what rights, what rules there are during the election process. Those rules, in fact, are more or less stable. They do not change much. The election code that took effect as of the beginning of this year has not changed those rules of the game that existed before. Well, as regards the media work, yes, of course, only within the context of the subject we're discussing here today, in terms of the information support to the election. That's why for many media, these rules are well known. However, as practice and experience show, we have had many election campaigns, and we see that the difficulty is there between information and campaigning, separating them, distinguishing between them. That's a fundamental issue that usually media lawyers start facing during every election campaign. Today we will only talk about the issues related to information support. It's very good that we have proper provisions in the election code that allow the media to inform the voters? Well, first of all, the election code has a legal provision that establishes the foundations of the information support. These are the basic things where they say what this is done for. Why do we all need this information support? So, the law establishes that the main objective of information support is so that every voter can make a conscious and free choice. And in fact, to reach that objective, all the mechanism as established by the law should function. The legislator has suggested that in order to reach that goal, every voter, including, and it's a novelty, including the voters who have problems with eyesight or hearing, the government can guarantee access to versatile, objective, and unbiased information that they need to make this conscious choice. So this principle of versatile, objective, and unbiased information, those three principles are basic ones. And on the basis of those principles, plus a number of others that we will mention later, they can distinguish between campaigning and information. Now, the law finally suggests that there should be equal access to this information, including for the people who have eyesight or hearing problems. That's a progressive step ahead. And even now in this studio we have the sign language interpreters who are also explaining those main novelties to the people with certain disabilities, allowing these voters to participate in the process of decision making and getting the information that is related to it. It's important that the Central Election Commission has the duty to identify the volume information and the formats in which this information would be provided to those voters that they need to get proper knowledge to make their choice. As to the principles, the law says that the election commissions and the media and information agencies, public authorities, their officials, associations of citizens, and even all the other people, which allows us to think that even rank and file people, while disseminating information on the election that is not part of the election campaigning, they all have to comply with a number of principles. And these principles, we'll see them on the right column, such as that it should be objective, unbiased, well-balanced, authentic, full, accurate, and there is a principle according to which one should avoid discrimination and sexism. It's also a novelty, and it is in line with the latest trends that tell us that the Ukrainian legislation becomes more up-to-date, and we also have certain work to combat discrimination and sexism. That's a progressive provision. All those principles, they are the fundamental ones that allow one to separate campaigning from information, because no campaigning can be objective. It's always a subjective opinion of every participant of the campaign. What does the objective information, objective principle mean? It means that one should provide information on the elections without one's subjective view, to describe things as they exist in the environment, without providing any subjective nuances to it. The principle of unbiased, that means that the information should not be biased. The journalist should be above the process, should not delve into it. They should provide information regardless of their personal likings or inclinations. The principle of balanced information means that one should provide comments coming from different political forces, and at the same time, if certain processes are discussed related to an election or certain events, they should also contain expert opinions of independent experts. Can we have balanced delivery of information during campaigning? No. Well, this issue primarily, the question can be asked about what political forces, which ones. Yes, it's an eternal question that is always discussed. Now we have, 192 political parties that have submitted applications to the CEC saying that they are going to participate in the local election. How can one provide their comments in a balanced way? Well, at least you have to take the opponents, the parties that have very opposite positions and points of view. If this is some kind of a program on the election campaign, then it would be good to engage different political forces now and then, and not just 2 or 3 selected parties or selected candidates. Let me add, from another point of view, from the point of view of standards and ethics, if a candidate criticizes another candidate or another party, to have balanced information, one should give the other party the right to reply. But that's within the standard of journalism. Well, it's more of an issue for campaigning, because you see, when we're talking about the right of reply, well, it's not so much a reply. It's just to give a chance to make another comment. Right, if we're talking about certain events related to the election, yeah, of course. However, we're talking about information support now. And in this context, we're primarily saying that all the information related to the election, that is part of the information support, should be more neutral emotionally. Although, if an event takes place and a party or a candidate, they deserve to be criticized, then of course that should not be ignored. And later we will say that the law directly bans to be silent about socially important pieces of information and or public interest. And in that kind, one should interview both the person who has been criticized and at least an independent expert, or another political force that can provide their own assessment while avoiding campaigning as much as is possible. The principle of authenticity. Usually when we talk about the media standard of authenticity or veracity, we should say that we're saying that the journalist should be using sources that are competent, that can really provide accurate and verified information or authentic information. That's the principle of credibility. While we should be sure that they provide information that is true. The principle of authenticity is sometimes interpreted in a different way in the legal science. That means that the information should have a factual base, should be based on certain facts, and then the election code also discloses this principle, as it ensures that the journalists should check their information, and even the law directly says that there should be at least 2 sources of information. And of course it would be good to turn to the original source. Well, according to the standards, one should even have 3 sources at least. Well, that means that the standards, although unfortunately all the monitorings show that we have very many media that ignore the standard and that are just lazy, or maybe they don't have enough time or qualification, etc., to do that. So it's a big problem. Yesterday, when I was thinking about those principles and about how they are applied in the application of law, I think that judges and lawyers should really pay attention to those principles, to standards of journalism, because that's the future problem. Because if we go down into this subject, then the litigation may get a different slant. And I'm sure that one day we will have read it. You mean within the context of election campaigns? No, not only. But an election campaign also gives, rise, generates court disputes, and I think that we will be discussing this subject at the next webinars. Okay, the principle that the information should be full and accurate means that the information should be provided in full as much as possible, everything that one knows at the time when a certain report is aired or an article is written, without distortions, without manipulations. And the principle of avoiding discrimination, sexism, that's clear. One should not give bad information about a person. One should not discriminate against a person based on one's color of skin or one's religious beliefs or one's political views. Yes. So the discrimination is banned in Ukraine. It's banned with a special law, but finally we can see that in the election code as well. Can I ask a question about discrimination, about this latest novelty? Don't you think that introducing this provision should mean not only liability, but it has a kind of educational function? That is to remind people that these are very important things, because quite often not only the media, but the media, they just kind of rebroadcast the language that contains discrimination or sexism or some other bad things that politicians are saying without critical assessing them. I think that it gives us all the participants in the election process, good reason to think about the problem. Yes, I agree completely. I also believe that this is a step ahead, even in order to bring our vocabulary in line with the standard, because we are saying that there are feminitives that should be officially used in the Ukrainian language, but even this legal provision, it in fact allows to introduce those feminitives in our everyday life, including political life. Now, as to the openness of the information, that's a very important thing, which usually emerges during every election campaign. The election code has just reproduced the legal provision that we had in other laws before that, which said that all the information contained in the papers submitted to an election commission to register a candidate is open, period. And usually the journalists who wanted to get access to this information, they would send requests. We've had a number of trials in the Ukrainian courts, and some of those cases are with the European Court of Human Rights related to the implementation of that provision. In particular, journalists from Rivne agency of investigative journalists called the Fourth Power during one of the election campaigns have sent a request for access to public information, asking for a copy of the biography of the candidates and their pictures. They've even asked for the pictures. And the CEC rejected that, saying that that information was confidential. And we always keep saying, look, it says it should be open. It cannot be confidential. Still, we have to say that our Ukrainian law is not very certain, not very clear in that respect, and I will try to show you that using certain cases. But for now, we're saying that there is the main rule, the main principle that has been established by the election code, saying that the information that is contained in the papers that are submitted to the election commissions for registration should be open. So access to this information is provided by either publishing it on the CEC website. There is some certain kinds of information that should be published there. Besides the CEC website, this information can be published on the websites of the regional or territorial offices of the CEC if they are set up. This information can also be published at the website of the lower level commissions if they have been established. If they have not been set up, then the commissions themselves would decide which resources would be used to publish this information. At least these should be the so-called information stands. And it's also possible to publish this information at the websites of the local councils of those areas where the election takes place. This is also directly allowed by the law. And the next rule, which is also very useful for the media, is where the legislator said that this information should be provided on request or in other ways as suggested by the law of Ukraine on access to public information. And this is the instrument that all the journalists can use. Within what period of time? That's very important because we understand that the journalists should work quickly. Well, the law on access to public information gives us a very short time frame. That's 5 working days. It's a week, in fact. Yes, it's a week. If there is a need to get an information urgently, if, for example, there is a threat to public security or there are all kinds of urgent emergencies, then there should be less time than that, but the general rule is 5 working days. And I have never yet seen situations where this time would not be enough during an election period. Usually that is enough because the journalists are interested in the parties and candidates in advance, and they would turn to the election commissions with their request asking for information. However, look, this is the information that should be published at the website of the CEC, and it should be published in the format of open data. That's the format that allows one to process this information through automatic processing, that is machine-readable information. And this format, the CEC should publish the name, well, all the names, the last name, even the patronymic of every candidate, the birth time and date and year and place. This information is usually confidential, but in this case, the election law says that it should be published. Citizenship, information on one's position, one's job, party affiliation, residence. Well, residence, one means at least a town or city. At least during the previous election, that was the approach that was suggested by the CEC, and I think that they will stick to it this time as well. Well, talking in terms of personal data, we started by saying that the main objective was to make it possible for the voter to make a well-informed and conscious choice. And in terms of the protection of personal data, if we balance it up, why would the voter want to know the exact birth date of a certain person? Well, if we were now MPs and if we were discussing the draft law, perhaps this argument could work. However, we're dealing with a ready law that just needs to be applied. Then the information about convictions, if it is there, should be published, and the candidates' programs, election programs, either of every candidate or of the appointing body of every candidate. That's what the CEC website should publish. But where do we see problems there?
We said that the information given in these documents must be present, but if we look at other corresponding norms, but we see when the candidate who provides this data, they agree to for their personal data to be published. This is the issue that was characteristic of the previous elections, when there is no clear definition of the personal data, and everybody can interpret it in a different way. So it is similar to the list of the open data, and in fact, the personal data can be viewed differently. In particular, in the list that we've seen, there could be information about employment, and all this is recorded in the CV, in the personal data, and I made an abstract on from this provision, and regrettably now we don't need the information, we didn't have to inform about the employment history, about public activities, but these facts are important, are critical for informed and conscious choice, because every candidate has a certain background which might influence on the voters whether to support this candidate or not. And the necessity of covering these issues was removed. So there are other documents to be submitted which can be controversial. So this is the CV, the personal information, which must include, as you see here, this is the list of documents. So this is the educational background, the address of residence, and the contact phone number. As for this information, we had some arguments with the CEC during the previous election campaigns, because the journalists demand the disclosure of the personal data, and they say that this information is not published on the CEC website, and they request the copy of the CV, the personal data of the candidate, and taking into account the fact that the law recognizes this information as open data, well, why does it concern the educational background? Because with the address and the phone number, it's kind of obvious, but education, the information about the educational background is not that obvious. So the law on information regards this, the information on the educational background as confidential. So we must understand that the election process and the candidates is the one context, but those grassroots, those common people who don't participate in this process, it is obvious why this information in that case is not made public. These websites must contain this streamlined norms and clear-cut requirements. They cannot be contradictory. Correct me if I'm wrong, the main hook, or as we can say, the basis or the underpinnings of the CEC position is that the election law stipulates that there must be the agreement of a person to publish this personal data. And with regard to the personal data, the general rule is applied that we can distribute and disclose this data only in case of previous consent. It's only related to the personal data because it's a part of a biography of a person, and we could have classified it as such. And we can also claim that the biographical data is everything that happens to a person, and these discrepancies exist, and they are still persist in the election legislation. Maybe right now we will deal with it. We will introduce certain amendments and corrections. So the candidates submit photographs, the application for registration, and the first and the second page of the passport. So can we consider this information open? I think that definitely not, because there are two contradictory norms which are in direct conflict with each other. What public interest can be in those two pages of the passport, because the name and the date of and place of birth is published, and the serial number and of the passport is recognized as confidential information, and this is not relevant. Despite the principle of openness of information in the documents submitted for the registration, I think that not all the documents in their entirety must be given by the CEC. So I would recommend to refrain from providing those pages of the passport, because this is sensitive data. It is confidential usually, and it should not be in public access, and elections should not change its status. And now, as for the employment history about civic activity for such cases, in fact, in 2013 I applied to the ECHR because of the refusal to provide biographical data about the candidates. We asked the question about the photographs, and the journalists have a very simple explanation for it, because in Ukraine we have this sad tradition when we have the technology of doppelgangers, when a lot of future candidates begin to change their names, including their patronymic, and the question is, who is who? And investigative journalists asked the CEC to provide the data and the photos for people to be able to make this informed choice, but we lost this case in the Ukrainian courts, so therefore we appealed to the CHR, and this is the way we chose. And our colleagues, the Center for Democracy and the Rule of Law, it was called back then the Institute of Media Law, they submitted an appeal and asked to be provided with the biographies of well-known politicians who were planning to be nominated as MPs. And they, just as us and the journalists I represented, were not given access to this information because of its nature, because of the confidentiality. And in March, the European Court heard this case and ruled that there was a violation of Article 10. And in fact, by refusing to provide biographical data, personal data, the CEC refused to provide information on employment background, employment history, and civic activities on the family, and on the address and the phone number. As early as the stage of the communication stage, the center stated that they didn't need the information on the address and the phone number and the family members, because this is in fact the confidential information. So the European Court didn't conduct any further hearings but they ruled that the employment history and the civic activity history should be made public, and the question on the educational background and other activities of the political candidates is socially relevant because this information can play a significant role in the voters' choice. And so the rule established the violation of Article 10, but this hearing took place after the code came into effect, so therefore it didn't have any repercussions on the legislation, but we hope that it will have further influence on legal practice to apply this judicial ruling and to understand what information should be disclosed to the journalists if they apply for it. It concerns not only the personal biographical data, but other data that could be relevant and cannot be classified as purely confidential information. Let's have a closer look to the general information support in elections. What is general information support? In a nutshell, those are issues connected with the explanation of voters' rights, election rights, and the ways to exercise those rights and to protect those rights. This is to inform the electorate on their rights, how to exercise those rights, on information on possible procedures on checking up the presence in the state voter registry, and this is the information on the address where the location where the voting process will take place, whether the possibility and the procedure of change of the place of voting, how to change the voter's address, the voting procedure itself, how to fill out the ballot. This is also a critical issue within the context of local elections, because the ballots, the actual papers, they changed. And they changed drastically, and I was listening to the webinar on Monday, which was focused on the filling out those ballots, and I have this question. Does it seem to you that the state and the relevant bodies, such as the CEC, they do not provide enough information, and people are ill-informed or completely uninformed about this? We think that if we post the information on the website, then everybody had the opportunity to read it. So we need to maximize our information coverage. Indeed, the CEC fulfilled their duties stipulated by the election code and published the relevant information on the website on the informational support during the elections. The lawyers can see it clearly, because this information draws on legalese heavily, or it describes those rules and procedures in legal terms, but maybe we should change the format. I can say that the law allows the CEC to spend money to conclude agreements with the media to spread this information, to raise awareness. As for the budgeting, it's complicated, but there's also an opportunity to make posters, how to fill out the ballots, but whether there's enough time for a person to correctly understand all these specificities, it's hard to say. In our previous webinars, which are recorded and posted on our YouTube channel, the projects of the Council of Europe, we've had already a discussion with the representatives of the CEC because we already have a new election system in place, and no matter how much effort we put into information campaigns, still this effort won't be enough. But we already can make an analysis, and you've seen that it's a huge campaign that you can indeed change your elector's address up to the 10th. It could be possible for labor migrants and other categories of people. Before that, these people did not have an opportunity to do this because they didn't have the registration in their respective community. So Donetsk, Crimea, as occupied territories. And despite all those strong information campaign, despite the videos that were provided in different channels, and despite the involvement of the NGOs and other bodies, it still wasn't enough. Because the outreach is important. It depends on the motivation of electors. We have to step up our activity, but we don't know the possible voter turnout if we had failed to provide such an awareness campaign. If we talk about the voter tally, then these elections will be a great challenge and a test for us. Because right now all the commissions on various levels, they lack experience, and the Pressing to Election Commission will start their work just before the elections on the 29th of October. So it's over 30,000 commissions, and we will provide methodological data, but the various experts and organizations have concerns about this arising issue, and and awareness-wise, we can say that the issue is complex, and I think it's not about the context itself. Maybe you could tell us more about it. We've started monitoring, and our human rights platform and the Institute for Media Communications and the Women in Media Associations and Stop Fake. And in fact, we don't see in the local media any information presence, any information campaign. I'm not even talking about candidates and the parties. There is zero information on the election process, and I think, yes, it is the drawback, but I can't explain why. So we cannot we can comprehensively cover the process, but not in times when the legislation is undergoing a complete overhaul. In July, we changed the election system. We changed the threshold for self-nomination, and practically 2 days ago there was the requirement for the certificate of good conduct, meaning the certificate of no criminal record, but we already had another draft law which completely failed in the Parliament of Ukraine because there were disagreements, but it's hard for journalists to cover these issues. So if the CEC has the right to publish this information, still we have the question of budget, of the funding. The legislation that was in place before this before we had the state and communal media. It stipulated that the CEC, based on budget funding, concludes the agreements with communal media for coverage, but now the law stipulates that the CEC, the election commissions, may conclude those agreements, but those contracts, but they are not obliged to. So I don't think that they will go looking for alternative means of spending those election budgets, but I think that because of the lack of money, because of the failure to conclude contracts with the media, we have this silence in the media. Of course, we could talk about this, but obviously, as you see, during the coronavirus pandemic and taking into account this fledgling economy, we're all looking for alternative means, but we must be socially responsible. Nothing boils down to just the monetary issue, but going back to the ways of publishing the information, of disclosing the information, that the obligation of the CEC during the second day of the election process, they must publish this relevant information on the website. And the CEC is also tasked with producing information posters that raise awareness about the voting procedures and the liabilities for violations. These commissions should provide the other commissions with this information. We cannot just put the blame on the media. There are also the election commissions and the government itself that must be held responsible for it, as they should allocate money and disseminate information as part of social responsibility. So there should be a certain budget allocated for this. And if we concluded these agreements, these contracts for information support, then this information would be regarded social advertising, and the participation of the media in information support will be covered in greater detail by my colleague, and I would like to also dwell on the special provisions for the local elections. There are two types of information support. That the information about the rights, the liabilities, the procedures, and the violations. That there is a special information support which states that the electors must be informed about all the registered subjects of the election process and of the subjects of their nomination, and their campaign programs must be published, but, and please pay attention here, only the organizations of the parties of the subjects of the electoral process, and the publishing of such information, such materials, should refrain from comments, from discussions of political activities, because otherwise it would be considered as political campaigns. So the information is published, but depending on the means of its disclosure to the public, it could be regarded as campaigning or information. So the election funds and the also the contributions to those funds. We see that this question regards the information support of the elections, because all the persons that support this or that party or the candidate can provide a contribution, and they are to be informed about the means of such making such contribution. But the information support happens not at the expense of the election funds, and this is a nice bonus for the candidates, because people they get the coverage not at their own expense, but the election code states the amount and the size of the election funds must be published at the expense of those funds. And again, we have this kind of a discrepancy, because if it's information support, then the use of such funds is not obligatory, but it can be done through these funds. And I think that journalists will do that themselves, because it can be classified as sensitive information, and journalists are quite attentive to it. So you can save on this. But the law indeed has this discrepancy. And another case is registration. So in case of the cancellation of the registration, then the information is to be published. And the last issue is what concerns directly the media and the journalists. This is the coverage of facts and events relevant to the election process. This coverage is initiated by the media and at their expense, but this information must be covered based on the principles of objectivity, fullness, accuracy, and only in that case it can be regarded as information. But if this is information about discussions, and my colleague will tell you more about it, because discussions can be part of campaigning or information. So if you hold such events, they must be carried out with regard to the legal provisions, and the information must be classified as part of the information campaign. And the last slide I want to draw your attention to is what I've already told you about. This is the media participation, and the information support also stipulates the creation and dissemination of posters and booklets that contain relevant information on the, let's talk about parties, because they deal exactly with the parties. They must be produced by the election commissions of the relevant levels, and together with the ballots to be transferred to election commissions, and can be used during the voting to provide voters with opportunity to familiarize themselves with the relevant information in the day of voting. But regrettably, we put all our stakes at the media. We hope that they would publish these materials, this information, but as a rule, they cover the information about the candidates who were active in the media before, and maybe there are new candidates that they want to be fair and honest and keep their integrity as political candidates. So we have this specific understanding of how to become interesting and attractive for the media. So to each his own. Everybody has their own way, and of course, if there is a huge number of candidates, then the media will focus on those who could be considered the biggest attraction for the audience. And this could be regarded as a negative trend in the media, and it could be considered a separate issue.
Ну,
And now I'd like to give the floor to Alexander Burmakin. We're now at this stage of the legislation and legal requirements to the election media coverage. I think that's an important issue for the journalists and for the voters, because all of them are stakeholders. In fact. Yes, Diana, well, we have never moved away from that subject matter, because the previous presentation was also about the election code, and I will follow up on what Ludmila has said. But let me start by talking about the media coverage standards with international standards. Briefly, let me remind you about how it should be. We should talk about how it should be according to the standards, and then I think it would be much more interesting when we talk about what we really have. However, why is the freedom of speech important? We can see that in the slide for a simple reason. According to the international standards, and here you see the Venice Commission Code of Good Practice in elections. But the European Court is also saying quite often that a democratic election is impossible without the free speech. If we have organized the process ideally, if we have tabulated votes fairly without any manipulations, if the parties can really act freely, but there are mass violations of the freedom of speech standards, censorship, and other violations, then this election will never be considered democratic. The freedom of speech, the freedom of dissemination of information, the freedom of media is one of the cornerstones on which all the election process is built. You see here also the freedom of association, the freedom of movement, in particular the association to set up political parties, but the Venice Commission experts stress that without complying with human rights, but even the fundamental rights, among which the freedom of speech and freedom of media. This again is an international paper, recommendation of the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe on the media coverage of election campaigns, and here it also contains the criteria that Ludmila has mentioned, which on the one hand are requirements to the coverage, on the other hand those criteria would allow us to separate the information and coverage from the campaigning, the subjective fight of the political forces for the votes. But you see that among those recommendations, in this recommendation there are also important standards saying that the role of the media in the current modern world is especially important during the election time. The election coverage should be true, well-balanced, and unbiased, and those three criteria, true, unbiased, and accurate, well, they're talking about broadcasting here, but different countries have different situations where, for example, printed media can say that it supports a certain political force. However, if they declare it openly, then the audience would understand that the editorial board, for certain reasons, support a certain political force. But the broadcasters, but here we're not talking about press, it's just party media. Well, party media can be biased. But I know that, for example, some Western media, printed media, they often declare their position, but in a very open way. And they clearly differentiate between the coverage of the facts and opinions. So this all is very transparent, and they don't have when they declare their support of a certain political force, it doesn't mean that they will violate professional standards, and they really stick up to it. In this recommendation, we also see that the election coverage should meet the main principles of the freedom of speech. There is a reference to Article 10 and the case law of the European Court, which is part and parcel of Article 10. Here, unfortunately, online is not a part of it. I think it's a weak point of everything in the international and Ukrainian documents. Well, it's a recommendation of 1999, and online had such a rapid development starting 2008, 2010, I guess, but the case law of the European Court, I'm sure we have some judgments on online practices, and I would say that there is not enough regulation in many countries concerning online. It's a fact many countries face a lot of problems related to that. Well, within this context, we can cite the example of France, where they have adopted certain amendments about exactly the election period. They have introduced criminal liability, huge fines of millions of euros, and it has been criticized harshly. As far as I know, it is now with the Constitutional Court of France, that decision, so nobody knows what its fate going to be. Something similar was also adopted by Germany, and there they also had huge discussions about the quality of that bill, or the law now, and we all know the history of the draft law on the media, that also is undergoing quite hard times. Everything related to online and online coverage during the election process should really be improved on the legislative, on the legal level, because Ludmila has already said that if we look at our election law, in terms of online, it is more or less outdated. And since 2015 or even 2014, it was no longer in line with the current reality. Now we're in 2020, and it has become evident now that when in the election law there is no word like internet, no social media regulation, which is very actively used by political forces and more and more with every day. So that's quite evident. Our legislation in terms of online is outdated, is obsolete, but we as lawyers are saying that for the internet campaigning should be covered by the same requirements and demands as any other form of campaigning, because the formats of campaigning is not a closed list. Anything that is not directly banned can be done. But thanks to contracts and the election funds, these all general principles should apply to the internet as well. However, for a very long time, the political party reports did not even have such lines in their reports, so it was impossible to say how much a party has spent for the internet. Well, it's good that Facebook now publishes it, this administrative part, and now observers and everybody else can actively monitor who spends how much. But YouTube has not opened it up, and Google has not. So all of it, including the issue of internet abuse, is still an open issue. However, all those basic things about authenticity, balanced format of information, accuracy, Ludmila has already mentioned those 5 or 6 principles mentioned in our election code. They also apply to internet coverage. One can say that these are universal criteria. Moreover, it says very clearly that it's not only the media and information agencies, but other persons as well. Another interesting slide. The law should allow pluralism, especially during the election campaigns. And during the election campaigns, the information can be disseminated, which can be offensive, which disgraces candidates. Discussions can be heated. If on the national legislation level, and the Code of the Venice Commission says that, if there is very harsh regulation of the media during the election process with many restrictions and requirements, then such a law would be considered as the one that does not comply with European standards. Now I will show you several slides about the ECHR standards. But for example, a very interesting case that I would advise everyone who's interested to read about it, speaking about the balance between the freedom of choice. Lopes Gomes de Silva versus Portugal, where the case is very interesting, the judgment is very interesting, because there were two candidates during the election of a mayor of Lisbon, were just telling each other about what they think of the opponent in a very heated way. And they were, some very abusive and insulting things that were said. And one of those candidates, who perhaps was the most heated one, was held liable. And the European Court, when it heard that case, it formulated that idea that conducting a political discussion can be very heated and everyone uses the arms that one has, and there is nothing unusual for a heated political discussion. In other words, during the election process, the media can cover that if such discussions take place, so that the voters could see who has what in one's head and how one behaves. But here the question is whether the media would provide unbiased coverage of such discussions. Yes. However, there are certain standards here. There are 8 main standards here. They're very important to understand what the media should do during the election process and how the European Court would kind of approach as it applies. Well, the general standard is that the media should inform people about the current events. That's the role of the media. But again, it says that the information in the election period should circulate freely to make sure that people can have, let's say, free choice while electing legislative authorities. However, free dissemination of any information, while the activities or inactivity of the government, just like its mistakes, should be scrutinized not only by the legislative but the judicial authorities as well. This is the role of the media, because it's a watchdog. It should really inform the people about anything happening. But the European Court, as it hears election-related cases, it keeps emphasizing that the election process in itself is a publicly significant event, so it's already an important context. Again, politicians should better tolerate criticism because their participation in the political process is voluntary, and that's the concept of a public person. And here one may discuss whether this level of being a public person is also true for the candidates. But I think that the person that registered as a candidate becomes already a publicly important person, and because that person goes out to the public arena. Well, I think that all of our politicians should know about these standards because they don't like to be criticized. Well, I can tell you more than that. Ludmila and I, we have had many cases in the courts. Most of our claimants against the journalists are the politicians or high-ranking officials. For some reason, they feel insulted more than anybody else. A very important standard that is not only the form and only the content, but the form should be protected. That's in terms of sarcastic, even words, even provocations, and of course the presence of public interest is a necessary precondition for the protection of polemics. That's a universal standard, but it is important during the election process too, because public interest, through its prism, very many competing interests should be balanced. And again, protection of personal data and the possibility to have harsh criticism and dramatic format of it, all of it depends on the presence or absence and the level of public interest. I won't go into that. Ludmila has already talked about that. We're proceeding to the election code. What is very important, and the objective of the work of the media during the election process, you would see that at the end, that the voter should make their free and conscious choice. can the voters do that? Well, we will now discuss it within the context of our media reality. Well, these are the basic things that Ludmila has also mentioned, and I also want to emphasize that those requirements to the coverage have been established by the law. So this is a legal requirement in terms of the work of the media during the election process while covering the process. And that's a unique construction, as a matter of fact, because in normal life, we don't see such coverage standards. They're not required from the media, but except for the election process, where there is this combination of requirements to the coverage. Because in normal life, we can speak about authenticity and objectiveness. We have it in the law, on the radio and TV, but for example, the information should be full and accurate and unbiased. But it's also a part of the professional standards. That's important. It is very important, because at many workshops for journalists have been long, let's say, rebroadcasting the idea that the code of ethics of Ukrainian journalists is not only ethical standards or requirements toward one's professional activities, and if you comply with it, then you're a good boy. No, I'm completely sure, and as a media lawyer in the courts, I can say that a journalist who is ethical and professional has the highest level of legal protection in the trials. So these things directly correlate. The journalists who comply with the standards it would be the easiest for us to protect them, defend them in the courts, because you can always say to the judge that one did it in a fair way and complied with all the other professional standards properly. It's just that at this level, because of the importance of the election process, there are such additional requirements, and a part of those standards have been established by the law, which also speaks about this correlation that I mentioned between the professional standards and the legal protection of the journalist activities. That's where we see how those basics are decoded. We can find it in Article 49 of the Election Code, that is a ban to ignore publicly important information. This is more of a declarative standard, because it's quite, hard to prove that a certain piece of information is, ignoring publicly important information if it was known at the time when they were disseminating this information, but it would be difficult to analyze it. And these are the standards of authenticity and accuracy. That is, one should not distort the information. Well, yes, has been somewhat disclosed, this requirement. One should try to get information from at least two sources or more. We all know, and Diana knows that sometimes there are situations when there is just one source. We can't get another one. It can happen. Well, but it would be better to avoid such situations. One should try to. Well, I have a very simple example. We have an official source. Well, in terms of official sources, the situation is somewhat different. Yes, but it is not an exception here. It says two sources. But if we have an official source, even on the legal level, we presume that the official source is accurate. But again, the standards have been established legally, and we would see that for the TV and radio organizations, there are additional two requirements. Well, the first one is not a requirement. They would decide by themselves how much air time they can allocate to the coverage. I think that's a normal provision. However, for the broadcasters, they say that they cannot provide a beneficial attitude to certain subjects of the election process. And here we can talk about our monitoring. It is the monitoring studies, in terms of quality and quantity, show that unfortunately the standard is not met by the large TV channels and by the regional ones. And there is also a requirement for a balanced coverage as regards the comments made by the candidates or parties or the subjects of the election process. But it's also strange that it only covers the broadcasters, because it should, apply to everybody. And these professional standards, they also require that all the standards, all the editorial boards should comply with it. But it's not a part of the law. That's why the journalists would often say, well, what kind of liability do we have? You can say that we're bad guys and that's it. Well, that's general principles that we have talked about. They apply to everybody. And through the prism of those principles, other types of media can also be compelled to comply with the standards. Well, there is also a context in terms of the international standards, because on the level of the Council of Europe recommendations, there are, let's say, the core requirements to the broadcasters. Audiovisual media are harder because they have the biggest effect upon the audience, and there is a more liberal approach to the printed press and online. On the other hand, all of those provisions have emerged after 2008, 2009. And clearly that section of our law about information campaigning should have been reviewed long ago. And I'm sure that it should have a completely different format. However, the previous webinar, several times with the experts and the CEC members, we said that after this election, the election law should be reviewed again. Well, we're saying this at every election period. Well, in terms of information campaigning, there is a specific feature, because I have been engaged several times to drafting bills, and if you remember, there has been quite heated discussions about whether campaigning should be allowed or banned on TV. There has been an idea to restrict it, to ban it. There have been different approaches, and there are certain ideas about that. That as regards this area, as soon as a law is drafted and then somehow evaporate at this stage of the adoption. When we worked in September and October on the election code, after all the amendments suggested about campaigning, only about 20% lived to see the first hearing, the first reading, and by the time of the second reading, they had all disappeared, because this is the most delicate thing for all the media. There are rules of the game in the information space. For some reason, those people who have the resources, or they are interested in having no change. Well, because everyone knows what offices to go to and how much money one should bring into a certain office. Why change what is already working? Yes, the cost of the election campaigns is perhaps one of the highest ones in Europe. 70 or 80% of the budgets, they go into TV, advertisement, campaigning, etc. And that's one thing. Another thing is that our election funds are not limited. And therefore those parties and participants of the election process that have support of financial groups, a priori, they are in a much better position in terms of their chances for victory than anybody else who do not have the support of such financial and industrial groups. Well, because those groups, they also have their own TV channels. And they were saying that we cannot separate politics and business. We can't, because we have this section as regards information and campaigning. That's quite an interesting discussion, and we see that there is a direct link between those things. Okay, that's about the foundations. Now some more specific formats of coverage that we can see in the election code. Okay, the pre-election debate, that's what it can look like today. That was the local election 2015. Ludmila has already told you about that. That as regards the coverage, there should be a special format for the election debate. And it said that if a TV channel wants to have such a debate, then one should establish the rules of the game, the same conditions for all the participants of the election process, and in fact there is a regulation of the coverage of the debate as a form of coverage. Together with that, remember in 2019 when we had the debate at the stadium, and there were people who suggested that it should have only been broadcast by the public service broadcaster, but these are different things, because the debate that is in the format of coverage, it's well regulated, but does not prevent from any subjects of the election process to organize debates as campaigning, to pay for it from their election funds, to decide what the format would be, who their sparring partners would be, sparring partners, sorry. So debates as a form of campaigning is also there. Does the law say that it should be marked in any way by the TV channels? Because for the voters it would be very difficult to differentiate between. Yes, if it's campaigning, it should be marked. And it should not take place within one time slot. Well, I would go slightly ahead. We'll talk about it in the next webinar. But there is also a problem with properly branding it and marking it. Because if we look at the election code, we're saying it says that only political advertisements should be properly marked. Political campaigning is a form of campaigning. For example, there could be interviews or movies or films which we have already seen in our life. So because of such conflicts during the legislative process, there is a possibility of such loopholes. Because if I come to an agreement with the TV channel and I say that this is not political advertisement, this is another form of campaigning, then there are no more requirements of putting that, mark plate on the screen. However, now it looks like the broadcasters are going to comply with it. There is a new requirement now which is related to how to protect people with certain disabilities. It's about providing subtitles or titles, and we see that requirement in the law on the state support to the Ukrainian language. There are certain nuances there, but it looks like the National Broadcasting Councils and the broadcasters are saying that this requirement about the language and the titles, they will demand it from the subjects of the election process, so one should be able to see whether campaigning is properly marked because of the titles. So there are also problems with the marking, and as I said, that this is linked to political advertisement in two places. It is called not political campaigning but political advertisement. It's very easy to change that. It would be very easy to say that there should be this kind of a marking to identify all kinds of campaigning, while it only says only for political advertisement that is one of a dozen formats. That's why marking it, and it is important because we will talk about how it's happening, unfortunately, all this. Now, as to monitoring, as to overseeing, that's another important issue. We will not talk a lot about that. However, let me talk about the most important thing here. There is a saying that our laws may be hard, but this is compensated by the fact that we do not have to implement them. And unfortunately, there is a lot of legal nihilism in our society. And until we can have proper sanctions, irreversible sanctions, many different subjects of the process believe that the rules, if any, do not necessarily have to be met. And unfortunately, we have big problems in the election laws as well, because we do not have the regulators for all types of the media during the election process, and even those sporadic sanctions that we can see them in the law are very hard to be applied. And that leads to a situation where we would have rules. Maybe these are not very good rules. They're not for all the media, but we have some regulators. But the third part, which should be binding so that it would all work as the legal standards, as the rules that everyone knows. As regards to sanctions, we have the biggest problems. That's why this mechanism is really somewhat disbalanced. Well, I think that we have this Ukrainian peculiarity here, because when we start speaking about responsibility, liability, sanctions, then people will start talking about political censorship at once. So this line is very thin. Yes, I agree, but our monitoring shows that the media violates those standards en masse and violate those legal requirements, even on an elementary level. We're now going to have a website about the interactive surveys, and they should mark it to say that only the TV audience is now interviewed, and this is not a representative polling. But in 2019, most TV channels did not comply with that standard. When we talked about that to the public service broadcaster, they say, oh, yeah, we forgot about that, but we will properly mark it. Why does that happen? Well, we have regulators for the broadcasters, the National Broadcasting Council, but in terms of procedures, and you may remember last year we had a lot of discussions with them, but they really work like observers rather than regulators. They're monitoring, in fact, registers many violations. They write pretty reports about that would correlate to our data, but there is no response to it, and there are no sanctions because the quality of the law is quite bad.
This is not the issue with legislation, but also the case of political will, because we could include certain political mechanisms. The state radio broadcaster, it is inscribed into the election code after the latest amendments, but they have in fact no rights. So the protocols could be drawn based on the violations, in part which concerns the media, but I do not observe any instances of such application. But the most interesting thing is that when we were working on the media project, then the National Broadcasting Council cannot regulate the internet and the press, because they are tasked with television and radio broadcasting. So then the question, why our Committee on the Radio and TV Broadcasting, why does it regulate the printed media? So this is another interesting aspect. So in terms of liability, there is an article 213.9, we have the long-suffering delict, or the violation. This is the provision of the benefits to any candidate or any political force or any political power. So there is a violation of the lack of bias. So when some information is simply withdrawn, so there are fines, 170 hryvnias for a national broadcaster. So this is peanuts. There can be other violations. So when the official in power commits violations. So, but again, the fine amounts to 850 or 1,700 hryvnias. So the terms and the code itself is said to be not the working code as claimed by lots of lawyers, and I had a big discussion with the National Council the previous year, and they do have the legal basis for regulations, the legal tools. So as you've mentioned, that there is a lack of political will. So the previous year they were active in observing and reacting to violations, but if we're talking about other sanctions, then yes, there are issues. So conducting checks and establishing the fact of violation, all of that requires a certain kind of reactions, and because the regulator must demonstrate that they do not only observe but also regulate and exercise their power. We know that it's a gradual process, and these sanctions can multiply. I'm not sure what would happen to the law on media, but the kind of we could use prevention and preventive measures and warn them about the extension of their licenses. This could be another leverage. So we talked about the special status. There are extra guarantees on free circulation and about some sharp polemic expressions and the distribution of certain information. So the media faces lots of special limitations, special conditions. And I would like to add a specification. It is not about the content but also the form of expression, because we talked about the bias at the very beginning, because I can interpret the law in the context of different genres, because the news must be unbiased. The author's commentary and the opinion pieces, this is a different matter altogether and can be approached differently. These are the European standards that concern some polemic expressions. If this is a standard, then we can regard it in terms of bias. We need to analyze a specific case only, because it can be a series of TV shows, TV programs, or but we cannot talk about it in purely theoretical terms. We can only discuss it when we face a specific article, a specific opinion piece, because I already gave you the example with the Portuguese. The candidates made their own claims and the journalists just described it. But in fact, this is the first case that the ECHR heard when Tatiana Korobova, when she called one candidate the mouthpiece of the Ukrainian authorities and the president, but the court stated that it's not just the content but the form that is copyrighted and protected. The journalists might not be aware of the case with Tatiana Korobova, but we should bring up this case, because the opinion piece published in the newspaper was a very high visibility case. So in terms of information, I think Ludmila already mentioned it, that sociology, it must be taken into account, because this is what comes under manipulation. And another novelty is that if before we just had a collision, then nowadays everybody must disclose the names of the commissioners of the poll, because whoever carried out and organized the press conferences were not tasked with this. This was only the obligation for the media, but when the original sources lack this information, then that's the issue. And it still goes on, because the legislation already changed and was amended in this part. And when if anyone publishes this information without compliance with the sociology rule, then there could be repercussions. When it comes to the polls, there is another case. Of course, information. So, because it concerns information, but the guarantee that is constantly violated, and the opinion polls, the exit polls, can be published, the results can be published only after the election stations they close, and this once the journalists from the democratic side, and I would like to remind you again that this is a very important guarantees, because the disclosure of this data before the election, the voting has been concluded, could influence the opinions of the voters. This is pure psychology, because people who are still going to vote, who haven't voted yet, when they read up on the exit poll information, they psychologically side with the majority. Sociological research proves that. So that the people side with the probable winner, and these are not the norms taken out of the blue. These are the guarantees based on practice. And as for the interactive polls, this norm is also regularly violated. And what we noted in 2019, the simple norm to avoid manipulation, because if during a certain talk show, it's just an example, how we build these graphs and percentage points. It can be polling by phone, via internet, or the combination of different audience reactions. If it happens this way, and this is obligatory when it comes to the elections, there must be a warning that this is not a representative poll. This poll only reflects the opinions of the people being polled, the people who communicate with the show, with the studio. And what happens in reality? Here we should understand the realities. Maybe Diana will tell us more about it, but I think that Ludmila is well aware about it. This is not the new fact for the media. This is where you can make money, and it's perfectly understandable, because the media need money for their own subsistence. But what are the negative repercussions? So they accept cash for loyalty packages and of different formats, ranging from the principle of honesty and lack of bias, can be complementary. Those can be packages that withdraw information about the competitors, or maybe the packages that provide some mudslinging or blackening of the reputation. So, and then they charge money to remove this information. So there is also such practice in place. So the lack of marking of paid materials in election campaigns, because sometimes the commissioner sets the requirement. Either we do it my way or it's the highway. So otherwise I won't pay you. So the election campaign materials that is devoid of any markings has more influence on the voters than other kinds of materials. So there are certain leverages that can be used against the competitors. So these are the cases of abuse. It is critically important who the owner is. It concerns the broadcasters and other media outlets, even regional ones, because internet resources also play an important role. They are powerful players, say, in the local context, and there is lack of transparency online. And the research of my colleagues also finds out that sometimes there are no context for the editors and no contact information at all. There is lack of regulation, which is a drawback, and the deficiency of in the legal field. So the consequences could be the distorted information field, infoscape, mediascape, that the voters are not provided with the comprehensive information about all the competitors, not enough, the lack of information in general, and in our monitoring 33 online media outlets and in regional outlets, we've been carrying monitoring 24/7, and we noted the lack of analytical materials, but there is a lot of the so-called gene sub, because the fortnight has given us this advertorial and the whole influx of it, when these services can be paid for via election funds. This is another example of what we call advertorial, and there is another aspect to it. There are some provocational materials that want to actually see the discord among different groups of people, and they use certain irritants, and all this taken together, it results in disorder and chaos, in a lack of information for an informed choice, because the informational field, which lacks any regulators, that doesn't call for liability, with outdated rules and those but there are, say, basic standards, but they are not binding. All this complicates this free, informed choice. So now we have this slide that contains advice, which actually we're talking about media literacy and legal literacy too, because if a voter lacks it, if the system doesn't work as it should be, then they won't prefer the official sources, because social media are now used to spread provocation and other sensational and emotional content without the references to the sources. We have clear instances of abuse and violations of professional sources. Everybody has a vested interest in this election process, and if the voter fails to carry out those basic checkups, then it would be hard to make this choice. But all of it proves that we need amendments and changes in our legislation concerning the regulations in media during the election process, because we've been talking about the necessity of it since 2014, and on a systemic level, when carrying out amendments to legislations, organizing roundtables, and our latest conference was in, I think, 2016, with the support of the Council of Europe. But for now, we remain as we are, and we did not make any positive changes. So, as for the monitoring in the 2019 elections, this is the research that Diana has mentioned. This was the research carried out by the coalition of organizations, including ours. And this year we're carrying out this monitoring, but in a slightly different format. We're monitoring social media and online outlets. So the Committee of Journalist Ethics, they also use graphs and conclusions to show that the media a lot of media ignore the current legislation and the current norms and the regulator that we have in place for the broadcasters. Because maybe of the lack of political will again, and because of the lack of clear-cut regulations, they fail to fulfill their mission. And of course, the journalists themselves must be conscious of their responsibility. And let's talk about the interests, because this is one of the key aspects. Everybody must be aware of it, especially the voters, because every voter must understand that they exist in a specific informational environment, and we can use this diagram to show it. We have the voter, a specific person, who is the target of this whole performance, which is called the election process. Everything that's been taking place during these several months, all these informational messages, they target the voters. So because these people on October 25 must make their final choice, and all this powerful machine has been working to convince the voters to give their vote for a specific candidate. And we see that there are three stakeholders, three main players that participate in this process. This is the voter, the consumer of the information, the media who disseminate the information on the candidates, on the election process, on the parties, on specific events connected with the election process, and the candidates or parties or maybe organizations, because we're talking local elections. Those are the persons who are the interested parties who want their information to be disseminated. If we take the elector, the voter, then the main goal is to give the necessary amount of information to the voter for them to, in turn, to make their conscious choice. So it is in their interest to receive this required amount of information on the parties, on the preparation, on their rights, on how to exercise those rights, on how to protect them. Those are their interests to fulfill this goal. Therefore, to assess how well these interests are satisfied, there are specific criteria who demonstrate it. The first criterion is the quality of that information, of those materials dedicated to the elections. As for the quality, yes, the quality is there, but the quantity and this is we are talking the information necessary to the voters. There is this information deficit, information hunger for the quality information. The next is the allocation of necessary funding by the state, because of the lack of funding for information support, because the state does not have the budget for it, or maybe the budget is not provided in a timely fashion, then when it comes too late, and we waste a lot of time. So these criteria show that there are certain deficiencies in this respect. There should be legislation loyal for the media, so the journalists must not be punished for disseminating this burning, relevant, and sometimes critical information about the candidates, because sometimes the journalists could be afraid to do that. We remember the times when some media outlets shut down because of the dissemination of a specific information during the elections. The case of that concerned the publishing house Day, the Day newspaper. There weren't serious sanctions applied to this outlet for disseminating some contradictory information. But there was another case of a newspaper versus Ukraine. The case described the pre-election period. It was the elections of a mayor of the then Kirovograd, today's Kropivnitsky, and one of the participants of the election campaign accused the other of trying to kill him, but nobody could confirm that there was an attempt on his life, and the newspaper was punished, and the fine was really big, and the media outlet had to take out the loan to actually pay this fine. So the measure of loyalty of the legal practice of the legislation towards the journalists influence on how the interests of the voters will be met. So sometimes the information undergoes the so-called filtering, and then the voters cannot see the whole picture. Then sometimes the interests, sometimes and oftentimes, the interests do not coincide. So those who campaign want as much attention and as many votes as possible, and sometimes they want to cover some information, and they want to spread as much compliments, as many favorable facts and favorable views. So all those favorable election information comes to the fore, and they use various means to do that. Another financial aspect of this side is that every candidate wants as much information to be spread and to also save money. So when we have some favorable information that is disseminated freely, everybody is satisfied. This concerns the cases when the journalists do not fully understand their role and do not always apply the professional standards for journalists. and they make these so-called presents. There are other cases when the owner of a certain media outlet supports a certain candidate, and then the journalists are forced to do this. And it doesn't always involve money. There are other interests. So the benefits can always be drawn from it. So the publication of campaign materials without marking is another case. This is the conclusion that we make. In order to save money and to spread as much positive, favorable information as possible, in order to be able to influence the voters, they do this because it looks like some journalistic research, journalistic materials that can be trusted. If we take the sociological research, then the journalists enjoy a higher level of trust than the politicians. And the criteria that we can apply to the assessment how well these interests are satisfied.
The first criteria is the amount of the election fund. Well, in Ukraine, everything is right with that. The most important thing that the parties should engage persons who want to make their contributions. There are no restrictions. Other effective conditions to provide fair approach, and that means that the candidates should have equal access to the media. The law guarantees that. The presence or absence of critical materials on the candidates by the media, well, during our monitoring we can observe the presence of this kind of information in the information space to see whether it meets the candidate's interest. The transparency of financial relations, publication of financial reports by the candidates or parties. In Ukraine, we have the relevant legislation that guarantees transparent financial relations, and all the stakeholders can have access to those reports, study them, and then eventually publish the information on the funding of the parties and campaigns. And the disputes of a candidate against another candidate related to media publications. What do the courts do in such situations? Whether they restrict the freedom of speech in Ukraine? We have quite a liberal approach, and the litigation practice does not really impose restrictions on such industries. So I would say that here the interests of the media are the same as the interests of the candidates, and here the voters are left astride with their intrinsic criteria. And now coming to the media interests, Alexander has already said that during the election is the time when the media earns the bulk of its money. Everyone wants to earn, because this is the time where the election funds start functioning. They sponsor election campaigning, political advertisement, that is as a form of campaigning, and the media is waiting for it. They want to improve their financial status thanks to those contributions or allocations. But at the same time, they do not want to lose the audience. They want to preserve it. They want to expand it even. That's why the media are interested in having the right to really freely disseminate information, the comments, and to have as little public regulation as government regulation as possible. Clearly, the media are against censorship, and the absence of censorship is a positive feature for the media. Well, we have said that they are waiting for this time to have their budgets replenished, and if a violation takes place, then of course the media do not want to suffer, to get any serious sanctions for certain violations, infringements of the law. These are the interests of the media, to earn the money, to spread the information they believe to be necessary, and if possible to publish some editorials, to broadcast editorials, so that nobody would see that and nobody would touch them. Now that's an ideal world. Now, how can one watch whether those interests are met with the help of what criteria? The number and the quality of the media laws. In fact, our legislation has changed for quite some time, and everyone is aware of the rules of the game, of where abuse can be allowed and where it cannot. So we have the situation that we have today. The number of the judgments that do not favor the media initiated by the candidates, well, we will see what kind of this election campaign would be. But as regards defamation lawsuits, there are monitoring that we carry out to see whether digital rights are met and complied with. We see that there is quite a lot of case law as regards the cases about protecting one's reputation and disseminating internet information. We would have up to 100 court decisions a month, and the courts would quite often take the side of the claimants. Well, we have already quite a lot of decisions on the fake pieces, on the violation of the ethical code, but on defamation as well. There are all sorts of judgments and decisions favoring the media and not favoring it. So although we do not have very clear regulation, we have case law, right? And that's why an online journalist should be aware of that, should understand that in any way they should be working in the legal framework. And even the users of the social media, there's quite a lot of case law about that. Well, we have been saying these things for many years during the trainings, that it's a big myth to believe that the internet is an area where there is no liability and absolute freedom, because we've started having the first judgments in 2005 or 2006. Now the judges know how to do that. They know how to look for the domain owners, etc. So there is quite a lot of established standard case law and procedures as to what should be done by the judge, by the court, to prepare a case, to hear it, to have a good trial. And we have this framework law. Once we've started discussing it, I'd like to stress that recently we have seen that the European Court has started emphasizing that any person who disseminates information and that enjoys protection of Article 10 of the Convention immediately has a commitment to work as responsible media. And those standards that characterize the work of journalists should also be applied to any other user who gathers and disseminates information in public interest. That's why, as regards media literacy, we should bring this information home. We should tell the people that it's not only the media that have responsibility, and not only the journalists, but anyone who enjoys the right to the freedom of speech should comply with the standards. There was a deviation. Let's keep moving in terms of criteria. There is also such a criteria as the number of the media outlets that have been closed down as a result of trials. Recently, for the past 10 years, I think, or maybe more than that, we have not had such situations. In the end of the 90s and the beginning of the century, we had such facts that raised a lot of concerns, but now the situations where the media would be closed down to meet the judgments, we practically don't see such situations. And the last criteria that we should look at is the presence of the self-regulating authorities as a mediator and a conflict and an agency for conflict resolution. And during the elections, the Commission for Journalist Ethics, it becomes more active, and even the participation of those experts in our monitoring studies also provides a certain facts that can further be discussed by the Commission. Before the elections, the Commission continues spreading information that calls upon the media not to violate the standards, and they give guidelines as to what one should do in order not to be accused of editorial work. So this institute keeps developing. It should be expanded. Self-regulation is insufficient completely because unfortunately there are too many problems that it can manage, but in general self-regulation exists in the country, and it's important to support this institution and to create favorable conditions for it to expand its work. Okay. Who is the main player? That was the key issue we had to discuss today. And to answer this question, we see that each of those players, the media, the candidates, the parties, and the voters, they have their own interests. And if we get back to slide 1 of this presentation, we would see that still those interests intertwined. We have this kind of a small triangle in the very center of it. It shows that there are common interests for all the three players. So the main player is still the voter, the electorate, because everybody else works for them. But during the election campaigns, clearly other interests of the other players should also be met. Well, that's all I wanted to say. Thank you, Ludmila. We have taken all of our time, but we still have one small question to answer about the official, formal and informal sources of information during the election period. Yes, I'll be very brief. Let me just name some of them because there are many more, but these are the main ones. We've already talked about the difference between the formal and informal sources. Formal ones, well, the government sources or the public ones, although the Civil Code calls them formal ones. That's the ones about which we have the presumption of authenticity or accuracy of information. That should be the most credible ones, that should have the most credible information about the election process. The first source is the CEC. It has a section on local elections that has published already the election calendar, which really is very visible while it shows the events that should take place before the 25th of October. And I'm sure that in many cities we can have the second round of the mayor's election, so it can last till late November. There's a lot of other information about the general information support that one can already see at the CEC website. It contains a number of its decisions and comments about the local election. All of that can be found there. Another important website is this National Voters Register. There one can see the polling stations, find oneself in the voters list to check where you should vote. You can also introduce online changes to the register or to the voter lists. There's a lot of other useful information at this website. The portal of the Ukrainian judiciary. These are all information about all the hearings, all the trials, all the processes, starting with administrative breaches and to end up with criminal cases. All of this can be checked with the judicial portal. we also have it does not feature this slide, but there is an official resource of court decisions where one can also look for decisions related to the election process, analyze some specific facts that may be interesting for you. Another interesting system is the one launched by the Ministry of Interior, and immediately its first page, its home page, immediately shows you the information and analysis system, Local Election 2020, where you can leave your reports about any violations. There is a feedback form there. It will gather some statistics there. You would be able to see what kind of violations take place and how the ministry responds, as this is the main law enforcement agency that is to respond to all the violations. There are all sorts of Facebook websites, including the ones of the territorial commissions. I haven't seen their websites, but many of them have their Facebook pages. Some of them are quite active. This can also be used. And the local government or self-government websites, they can also contain information about the local elections, because a certain number of decisions are to be made by the local governments. Informal sources, well, there are many more of them again, but these are the Council of Europe election projects, thanks to which we are having this series of webinars, and there you would have all the recordings of the webinars we have. There is the Council of Europe Media Project websites, where you can have information on the monitoring of the media coverage, as well as other activities related to the media and its participation in the process. IFES, an large international organization that specializes in the election process, and its website will also give you a lot of current information, certain reviews, digests, analysis, legislative work. And in terms of content and categories, you'd be able to see a lot of it at the website of Opora, which is the leading NGO in terms of the election process. They have a network of their observers who would observe the elections all over Ukraine, prepare their reports. There you would be able to find a lot of relevant information about the election process in various regions. And you can also say that the websites of the many media are also informal sources, the media that can cover the election process. And how they do that, soon we will have our first interim report after we do the first informal monitoring. That's all we wanted to say today. The ones who want to find some information, both formal and informal one, can use lots of sources today. You just have to understand which ones are official, which ones are not, how you can trust them. Maybe you should check some types of information with other sources. Let me add that all those formal and informal sources are also sources of information for the media. In other words, the journalists should also use the formal sources, and I hope they will be doing that during the election campaign, because this is important. On the other hand, all the source of information should be checked. That's our golden rule, even the formal ones. If you have any doubts, try to check all the information. That's very important. Or at least refer to the source of information to avoid liability. That's also a standard. Thank you. That would be then all for today. We want to thank our experts. And I think I need to remind you that this is not the last webinar. We're going to have one more this Friday at the same time at 4 p.m. We will be starting it, so anyone who's interested in this subject, please join us, join our next webinar. All the best to all of you. Goodbye.